At Crimson Legacy Historians, every investigation begins somewhere unexpected. This one began with a photograph. It wasn't dramatic. There was no single document that appended everything. Just a photograph. A 19th century photograph of a building in Philadelphia. A tall, slender tower attached to what appeared to be a civic building, ornate beyond any functional necessity, rising to a point that seemed almost devotional. We had seen that tower before. We were certain of it, but we had never been to Philadelphia. It took 3 days to remember where. A postcard reproduction. Paris. A different building, a different street, a different decade on the caption, but the same tower, same proportions, same layered stonework ascending in the same deliberate rhythm, same windows, narrow and arched, positioned at intervals that seemed designed not for light, but for something else. Something we couldn't name yet. We told ourselves it was coincidence. Architectural fashion travels. Styles migrate. This is what historians tell us. And for a long time we believed them. But we kept pulling on that thread. The deeper we went into 19th century civic architecture, not the famous landmarks, not the monuments everyone photographs, but the secondary buildings, the utility structures, the towers attached to train stations and waterworks and municipal halls, the more the coincidence explanations started to strain, then buckle, then break entirely. What we found wasn't a conspiracy theory. It was a pattern. And patterns, in our experience, don't lie. Let's talk about the towers themselves, because they deserve your full attention before we go any further. Across the northeastern United States, between roughly 1840 and then, hundreds of towers were constructed, or so we're told, in connection with municipal waterworks systems. The official explanation is elegant and sensible. These were standpipes or pressure towers, tall enough to maintain hydraulic pressure across a city's water distribution network. Physics, engineering, practicality. Clean, modern, rational. The kind of explanation that closes a door very firmly, except the explanation collapses almost immediately when you look at the actual buildings. A functional pressure standpipe is by definition a large vertical pipe. You encase it in brick for protection, perhaps add a maintenance access door, and you're done. What you do not do, what no engineer would ever specify because it serves no hydraulic purpose whatsoever, is crown the structure with a copper-clad cup. You don't add decorative stone corbels at each story. You don't install narrow lancet windows at precise vertical intervals. You don't orient the tower's primary face toward a specific compass direction. The same direction in city after city after city. But they did all of those things. Consistently, uniformly, across dozens of American cities, across different architects, different construction firms, different decades, different municipal governments. And here's the strangest part. The documentation for most of them is almost non-existent. Not sparse, non-existent. For structures this elaborate, this expensive, this presumably significant to municipal infrastructure, you would expect detailed construction records, architectural drawings, budget approvals, contractor correspondence, the kind of paper trail that Victorian-era bureaucracy generated for the installation of a park bench. What if there are no construction records because there was no construction? What if some of these towers weren't built by the cities that claimed them, but were simply already standing when those cities arrived? Inherited. Incorporated. Quietly given a new official purpose to avoid a much more difficult conversation. The silence was deafening. If this were purely American phenomenon, we might have accepted it. American municipal records of that period are notoriously inconsistent. But it isn't an American phenomenon. Look at Central Europe, Prague, Budapest, Krakow, Warsaw. Cities that maintain extraordinarily detailed historical archives. Cities where the bureaucratic culture of record-keeping goes back centuries. And you find the same towers, same proportions, same ornamental vocabulary, same narrow windows at the same intervals, same copper or verdigris stained metal elements at the apex. And in many cases, the same almost willful absence of foundational documentation. In Bucharest, there is a tower attached to what was described in early 25th century city plans as a former administrative annex. Former administrative annex. 3 words that could mean anything, and in municipal bureaucratic language often mean that someone at some point decided the original description required softening. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision across the Russian interior. Kazan, Nizhny Novgorod, Samara. Cities separated by hundreds of miles, developed under different regional administrations, and yet towers, the same towers, rising from the same proportional relationships to the buildings they adjoin, sometimes attributed to local architects whose other known works bear absolutely no stylistic resemblance, sometimes attributed to no one at all, This raises a simple but critical question. Who was coordinating? In the 19th century, before the telegraph had fully transformed long-distance communication, before the telephone, before any mechanism existed for real-time architectural consultation across continents, how does an identical structural form appear in Philadelphia, Paris, Prague, and Kazan within the same 50-year window, with the same decorative elements, the same spatial logic, the same deliberate orientation? We are told it was fashion. We are told it was the influence of architectural pattern books, those illustrated volumes of design templates that circulated among practicing architects in the 1800s. And yes, pattern books existed. And yes, they circulated. At Crimson Legacy Historians, we have held some of them. We have read them carefully. Not one of them contains these towers. Here is an exercise we want you to try. Find a detailed city map of any major American or European city from 1860. Then find the equivalent map from 1960. Then from 1960. Then today, watch what disappears. Not the obvious casualties of urban renewal, the tenement districts, the old factory neighborhoods, the infrastructure of a pre-automotive city, giving way to roads and parking structures. That disappearance is documented, debated, mourned. There are photographs of the demolitions. There are newspaper articles. There are community protests preserved in historical archives. We're talking about something quieter, structures that appear on the 1860 map, sometimes on the 1880 map, occasionally glimpsed in the background of early photographic street scenes, and then simply are not there anymore. No demolition record, no replacement structure. Sometimes not even a gap in the streetscape where they would have stood, as though the surrounding buildings quietly shifted to fill the absence. In St. Louis, we cross-referenced Sanborn fire insurance maps. Extraordinarily detailed property surveys produced for insurance actuarial purposes from 1876, 1895, and 1909. Between the first and second surveys, 14 structures described only as tower, brick, purpose, unknown, vanished from a single district. 14 in under 20 years. And the 1895 map doesn't mark their former locations, doesn't record demolitions, doesn't explain the reconfigured lot lines that now occupy the space. Purpose unknown. That designation appears more than you might expect in 19th century urban survey records. Not waterworks tower, or bell tower, or fire observation post. Purpose unknown. As though the surveyors, professionals whose entire job was categorizing urban structures, looked at these buildings and genuinely could not determine what they were for, or perhaps declined to record what they suspected. We want to be careful here. We are not claiming to know what happened to those 14 towers. We are asking why their disappearance left no paper trail in a city, in an era, in a record-keeping culture that documented virtually everything else. The photographic record is troubling enough. The archival silence around it is harder to explain away. Beginning in the 1840s and running through the end of the 19th century, photographers across America and Europe documented their cities with an obsessive, accumulative thoroughness. These images are in major archive collections worldwide. They're reproduced in history textbooks. They're considered primary visual documents of the urban environments they captured. And in the backgrounds of dozens of them, not the focal subjects, not the architectural landmarks the photographers were commissioned to record, but in the casual middle ground and background detail that a camera captures automatically, the way a lens simply takes in what's there. There are towers, the same towers. We spent several months cataloging background architectural detail in American and European photographic archives from this period. It became, we'll admit, an obsession, and what emerged from that catalog was a picture of mid to late 19th century cities that looks substantially different from what we are typically shown in history books. Denser with certain kinds of vertical structures, more uniformly arrayed with what appear to be purpose-built towers, positioned at intervals that suggest, and we are choosing that word deliberately, some form of spatial planning, a logic of placement that isn't random, isn't purely aesthetic, and doesn't map neatly onto the known infrastructure needs of those cities. And then, in photographs made after roughly 1895, they begin to disappear. The backgrounds simplify. The towers thin out. By the street photography of the 1910s, the skyline looks more like what we recognize today. The particular profile of these structures, which had appeared so consistently for so long, simply stops appearing. No shift in photographic practice accounts for this. The photographers didn't change their approach. Unlike painters, they had no approach to change. A camera records what stands in front of it. So what changed was not the photographs. What changed was the cities. Here's where the physical evidence becomes impossible to ignore, and where we'll confess the conventional explanations we had been trying to maintain started to feel genuinely untenable. In cities throughout the American Midwest, Chicago, Cincinnati, Indianapolis, cities that were by all standard historical accounts largely wilderness or small settlements before the 1820s and 1823s, excavations for modern construction have repeatedly encountered foundations that don't fit the narrative. Not every excavation. We want to be precise about this. We are not suggesting that every shovel in the Midwest hits buried mysteries. But there is a documented pattern, reported in local newspapers, in construction company internal reports, occasionally in academic archaeology literature, of stone foundations exhibiting construction techniques and material aging inconsistent with early American settlement-era building, dress stone, fitted without mortar, in methods associated with much older European or pre-Columbian construction traditions, found beneath structures that the historical record says were the first structures ever built on those lots. In Indianapolis, the construction of a downtown office building in the 1960s reportedly uncovered a circular stone foundation approximately 40 feet in diameter, at a depth suggesting it predated the surrounding soil deposits by a significant margin. The excavation report, which we found through a records request to the city's Historical Records Division, after being told twice that no such report existed, described the foundation as anomalous and recommended further archaeological study. There is no record of further archaeological study being conducted. The building was constructed on schedule. Anomalous, purpose unknown. Former administrative annex. The language is always careful. The language always closes doors. This raises a question that the evidence keeps forcing back to the surface. Were some of these towers not built in the 19th century? Were some of them already there? Already standing when the cities we know grew up around them, incorporated into new buildings, refronted in the architectural fashion of the moment, given new official histories and new official purposes, documented just enough to seem explained. We don't know. We want to be honest with you. We do not know. But the question will not leave us alone. We want to return to the issue of orientation, because we've touched on it, and it deserves the full weight of your attention. In 2019, a researcher who asked not to be identified professionally because of the reception this kind of inquiry tends to receive in academic circles, completed a survey of surviving 19th century civic towers in the northeastern United States, 43 structures in 11 cities. For each one, the researcher recorded the orientation of the primary architectural face, the side with the most elaborate ornamentation, the largest windows, the formal entry point if one existed. Of the 43 towers, 31 had their primary face oriented within 5 degrees of true east. Not magnetic east, true east. Astronomical east, the direction of sunrise at the equinox. In a random sample of civic structures, you would expect roughly 1/8 to face within 5 degrees of any given compass direction. Statistically, approximately 5 or 6 of those 43 towers should face east. 31 is not a statistical anomaly. 31 is a design specification. And what do we find when we look at old star charts? When we trace the sight lines from those tower windows upward into the sky at the angles those windows imply. Certain windows in certain towers, positioned at elevations and angles that serve no obvious lighting or ventilation purpose, align with astronomical features. Star positions, solar events, lunar cycles, in ways that appear deliberate, in ways that appear consistent, tower to tower, city to city. Were these structures observational instruments? Were they receivers of something oriented towards some source we no longer recognize? Were they something else entirely, something for which we don't currently have a category? We genuinely don't know, but the evidence suggests something much larger than municipal waterworks. Let's talk about what happened between roughly 1890 and... because here is what the accumulated record, assembled from sources that were never intended to be assembled together, seems to show. A systematic, widespread, and surprisingly thorough removal of a specific class of structure from cities across the United States, Europe, and parts of South America and Australia. Not a gradual architectural obsolescence, not the natural attrition of aging buildings in expanding cities. Something that looks, the further you investigate, less like urban development and more like a program. In Cincinnati, between 1895 and 1915, city demolition permits cross-referenced against the Sanborn maps show a curious clustering. Permits for the demolition of tall, ornate, non-ecclesiastical structures cluster into a tight window between 1900 and 1908, not spread across the natural life cycle of urban development, clustered, as though a decision was made, implemented, and completed. In Buenos Aires, which experienced a major urban modernization push in the 1890s, the architectural record shows a similar pattern. Older structures that appear in pre-1818 survey documents and early photographic records, are replaced with new Beaux-Arts civic buildings in a remarkably compressed time frame. The official narrative credits a modernization drive, a desire to make Buenos Aires appear as sophisticated as Paris. And perhaps that's all it was. But the structures that were demolished, the ones you have to look carefully at old photographs to even see, bear a familiar profile. The same profile, the same towers, in Sydney, Melbourne, and Cape Town. Cities on entirely different continents, administered by entirely different colonial governments, with no institutional connection to each other or to Buenos Aires or Cincinnati. The same compression of demolition activity appears in the records within roughly the same 20-year window. This is what we mean when we talk about the coordination problem, because the question isn't just who built these towers. The question, the one that, once you've seen it, you cannot stop seeing, is who decided to take them all down? What conversation happened, in what rooms, between what parties, that resulted in cities on 6 continents quietly removing the same class of structure within the same historical window without public debate, without significant journalistic coverage, without the kind of civic controversy that the demolition of major urban landmarks almost always generates? We are not told. There is no record of the conversation, and the absence, not the towers themselves, but the silence around their disappearance, is perhaps the most unsettling thing we have encountered in years of trying to understand what these structures actually were. We want to sit with something uncomfortable for a moment. Human civilizations forget. This is not controversial. We lose knowledge regularly, through catastrophe, through the death of traditions, through the simple entropy of information across generations. The Library of Alexandria, the specifics of Roman concrete, the navigation techniques that allowed Polynesian peoples to cross the Pacific. We lose things, we have always lost things, but the forgetting we are describing here has a different character. It is not the gradual erosion of an unrecorded tradition. It appears to be the deliberate erasure of a recorded one. The distinction matters enormously. Gradual forgetting leaves traces, partial records, incomplete memories, surviving practitioners of diminished arts. Deliberate erasure leaves absences. It leaves the particular quality of silence that we have been encountering in archive after archive, city after city, continent after continent. What was known about these towers? What were they built to do, or to receive, or to transmit, or to measure, or to channel? What understanding did their builders carry that informed not just the construction of individual structures, but what appears to be a globally coordinated network of them? We can't answer that. The evidence we've assembled points toward a question, not a conclusion. There may have been a technology here, or a practice, or a way of engaging with the physical world that we have simply lost access to, that was removed from our access, perhaps deliberately, perhaps necessarily, perhaps for reasons we can no longer recover or evaluate. And that may be the most haunting possibility of all. Not that the towers were sinister, not that they served some dark purpose now mercifully buried, but that they served a real one, that they were part of a functional system of some kind, a system sophisticated enough to have been implemented globally, consistent enough to have maintained its design logic across centuries and continents, and significant enough that its elimination was considered worth the coordinated effort required. We might have lost something real and useful and perhaps irreplaceable. And most of us are entirely unaware that there was ever anything to lose. At Crimson Legacy historians, we keep coming back to those 2 towers, the one in Philadelphia, the one in Paris. The photograph that started all of this, we know more now than we did when we first noticed them. We know how widely this pattern extends. We know how consistently the documentation fails. We know how precisely the orientation data repeats. We know how compressed the window of demolition was and how geographically vast. We know all of this, and we are not closer to a final answer than we were at the beginning. Maybe that's appropriate. Maybe the honest position, when confronting evidence of this scale and this quality, is to resist the temptation of resolution. To sit with the anomaly rather than paper it over with a comfortable explanation that doesn't quite fit. What were the towers? Who built them across all those cities, on all those continents, in the same form and the same proportions, with the same deliberate orientations and the same strange, unnecessary beauty? What did they do? What did they know? What were they pointing at when they pointed at the equinox sunrise? What were they listening for? In those narrow windows angled at angles no natural light source required. And who decided quietly, without recorded explanation, that every city in the world was better off without them? We don't know. We're not going to pretend we know, but we are going to keep looking. Because once you've seen this, once you've held the Sanborn maps and the demolition records and the astronomical alignments and the silent archives all together, you cannot put them back down. The pattern is there. The absence is real. The silence was deafening, and it still is. And somewhere in the foundations of cities we think we know completely, the stones are still there, still oriented, still waiting. This is Crimson Legacy Historians, and we are only getting started. पूरी स्क्रिप्ट क्रिम्सन लेगेसी हिस्टोरियंस की वॉइस में रीराइट हो गई है. We are पर्सपेक्टिव से, बिना हेडिंग्स के और कंसिस्टेंट डॉक्यूमेंट्री टोन के साथ. अगर कोई सेक्शन और ज्यादा ड्रामेटिक या डिटेल्ड बनाना हो तो बता दें.